There was an awful lot of light in here. If you come in here during the week, it is awfully dark, so we have a lot of light on. Think about how you name people, or how you refer to them, or how you think about them, and is it a positive thing? Is it a negative thing? What are the monikers we lay on people's lives? We have lots of examples. We give nicknames to lots of people. Let me try a few of them. Anybody know, these are all sports analogies, so for some of you can, check out for a second if you want. Anybody know who the mailman is? Karl Malone. All right. We got some sports fans. Okay, 2 or 3. Karl Malone plays for the Jazz. You know why he's called the mailman? Because he always delivers. Got it? The Answer. Anybody know that one? I didn't know this one. I had to look it up. The Answer. Ooh, Allen Iverson. Way to go. Because he was the answer to Philadelphia's woes and the answer to his own family's financial crisis when he entered the NBA, so they called him the Answer. How about Matty Ice? That's moving over to football. Matt Ryan, football quarterback, is known as Matty Ice because he's got like ice in his veins. He's cool under pressure. Let's see here. The Big Hurt. Different sport again. The Big Hurt. Frank Thomas, baseball player, hits the ball so hard that they think it's going to explode. Known for the long ball hitter. The Big Hurt. All right, let's move back a little bit. The Refrigerator. You all know that one. Defensive lineman William Perry was given this very appropriate nickname because he was the size of a refrigerator. And if you remember, to the delight of everybody, he occasionally would go on the offense and play running back. And it was humorous to watch him drag these professional football players like they were little children. Gordie Howe is known as Mr. Hockey. Now, if you're a sports fan, if you're a sports player, and you are named Mr. whatever that sport is, you know that you own that sport. So Gordie Howe is known for that. How about Mr. October? This is a little older too, baseball reference. Reggie Jackson, that's right. In the playoffs, he was always known to hit better in the playoffs than he did during the regular season, and so the playoffs were in October, so he's Mr. October. Why is Michael Jordan called Air? Because he's always in the air. He's always off his feet. He's always flying through the sky. He was always known for the way in which he could leap. So these names sort of shape who they are and what we think about them. They're able to deliver. They're always flying through the air. They're a great hitter. They're as big as a refrigerator. How we see people shapes how we understand them and can either lead to limiting them or empowering them. How you refer to someone else tells you a lot about how you see them. So it may seem odd to, at least it's odd to me, that in our gospel writing for today, we had this long reading. We have all these long narratives in the season of Lent about the man who continually is referred to as the man born blind, or the man who had been blind. Think about what that would mean for you after you've been healed of something, to continue to be called the one who was whatever the healing needed. He described in our first verse, sort of as a descriptive of a narrative, because it's accurate, as the man who is blind. And he was a beggar. We hear both these monikers applied to him, but mostly the man that was born blind. But then at the beginning, and note that Jesus doesn't have a conversation with this man, really. He comes up and the disciples are talking to him, and this is like a drive-by healing. The man doesn't ask for it. He doesn't seem to deserve it. Jesus spits on the ground, wipes mud in the guy's eyes, and says, "Go wash in the pool of Siloam," which was known as for its healing powers. But then after that, he is referred to several more times. In verse 8, as the man who used to beg. In verse 13, as the man who was formerly blind. In verse 17, simply as the blind man. Think about the trajectory of that. As if those who were questioning him refused to accept the transformation that has taken place in his life. All those designations then invite us to understand him in terms of what he used to be, notably his limitations, his struggle, not so much in what he is becoming. Perhaps the intention is to recognize what is overcome, but I wonder if that roots us kind of too quickly and firmly in the past and risks defining him in terms of his limitations, the man that was born blind. Now that can work in positive ways and negative ways, right? I mean, Irvin Johnson, Irvin Johnson, his nickname is what? Magic. Why did he get that? Because he was a famous basketball. Remember, he was a basketball player at one point in history, and before he became an entrepreneur and business owner, and now a sports team owner. But he was known as Magic because his long career in basketball, where he could just sort of magically make plays happen. And yet, that was kind of, in terms of who Magic Johnson is and the length of his years, kind of ancient history compared to his longer career as a businessman and entrepreneur. Maybe he's still working magic. Maybe that's why we still call him that. That's the positive use of it. But there is also a negative use of how this works, doesn't it? Maybe if you're the black sheep in the family, and the family refers to you that way, no matter how you perform in life, you're always sort of known as the black sheep. We don't have to scratch too far in the gospel to find a lot of people like this. There's a lot of unnamed people like this man who never has a name. He's just known as by his condition, by his past condition, the blind man. Or last week, where we heard about the Samaritan woman at the well, who also was an unnamed person. Her stigma kept her life bound up in avoiding other people, retrieving water at an out of the way place, at an out of the way time. It shaped her life. It was a negative moniker. This woman who had so many husbands. I wonder how often we do that in our lives. How often you do it to yourself. How often you define yourselves in terms of limiting factors or difficult things that you've experienced. Even if we've overcome them and take a measure of pride in that, I still wonder if it does justice to our reality to link us too strongly to that past experience. When we refer to someone as divorced or widowed, we have categories. It's sort of a demographic box you have to check, And sometimes these things break down because you're no longer widowed if you're remarried, and yet you're widowed. And so for some folks, that's how you're seen. We may honor a significant relationship, even if it's ended, by defining someone, in essence, by a term of which they once were. I mean, sometimes that's positive. We can talk about being a cancer survivor, and you can know the positive associations about enduring an illness and overcoming it, which is great. But there's a risk, I think, sometimes if that's too much of the identity, almost as if it's just a single piece of who you are. In this story, it seems like it's just really hard, especially for the religious leaders, to accept that this man has received his sight again. They even debate if he's the same guy. He looks so different. John tells us that they wrestle with this new reality, to see him beyond anything that he used to be. And some folks don't recognize him at all. Others, including his parents, know that he has struggled, recognize his transformation, but are afraid to acknowledge it because of the pressure of others. That pattern seems to be throughout the whole reading, except for two people. First, the man himself, who seems to refuse to let go of this transformation. And secondly is Jesus. The man who can only rejoice in the gift that he's given and looks ahead with open eyes at the delightful future that God has now provided for him. It exceeds anything that he had imagined before, especially anything in the period of blindness. How else, I wonder, could he engage with the powerful religious leaders in the way in which he does? The way in which they intimidate, and yet he seems to relate to them with candor, irony, maybe even sarcasm and humor. Do you also want to be his disciples? This man has moved to be unafraid. Indeed, there's almost, in a sense, a playfulness or a joyfulness in this guy, because the worst is taken away. What can they do to him? They missed the understanding that he was the man that was born blind, but he's no longer held by that. And so there's a brave playfulness in his retorts to people of authority. I don't know whether or not he's a sinner. Don't talk to me about theoretical things. All I know is this: I once was blind, now I can see. Yes! Let's have a victory dance. And they don't want to join the dance. Here's an astonishing thing, he says. All you, white tower, ivory tower people, you don't know where he comes from, and yet he's clearly opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners, but he does listen to anyone who worships and obeys him. Never since the world began has anyone seen anything like this, a person born blind being healed. If the man were not from God, well, he could do nothing. Bravery. He has been given an open future, and nothing is going to keep him from seizing it. Jesus also looks to the future rather than to the past, inviting the man to faith and reveals himself to him. All of this leads the man now to see the opportunity to make a confession. So when Jesus tells him who he is, he simply says, Lord, I believe. It's a great trajectory, and Marianne named it earlier. The trajectory of this person's life. Just like last week, there's a character transformation taking place. He's an unknown man speaking in front of the blind man. The man becomes a healer because he opened his eyes. Still doesn't know who he is, but he's an unknown healer. Then he proclaims him to be a prophet. And then at the end, he says he believes him as Son of Man and worships him as if he's God. The man refuses to be held by his past. Can we say the same? We must recognize this man is now a disciple in the pattern of how John's Gospel tells us this. He heard the voice of Jesus. Remember, my sheep hear my voice? We haven't gotten that passage yet. He listened. He obeyed. He's become a witness, like the Samaritan woman who witnesses to the Samaritan. He's become a witness, in fact, a powerful one to the experience of Jesus. Suffered for it, was thrown out of the synagogue for it, was found by Jesus. I love the sense that the guy doesn't ask for healing, and at the end of the story, Jesus has to find him. Because remember, he was blind. He doesn't know what Jesus looks like. Jesus heals him without asking. At the end, Jesus finds him again and makes him a part of Jesus' fold and flock. To follow any of these facts means, or to deny any of these facts means that we return him to his plight and his suffering as a blind beggar. He was no longer bound to his past, but pulled into God's future now as a Christ follower. I think we need to do an inventory ourselves from time to time of our past, of the things that are binding us. The good, the difficult, the encouraging, the challenging, and ask which ones we need to let go of in order to open ourselves to God's future, something that God has prepared for us. What designations of ourselves or others no longer serve? Which ones shackle us to a past pain or a past failure? How do you understand yourselves in terms of the tragedy you've experienced, the challenge you've experienced, the limitations that you've had? And how might you grasp a hold of the open future that God's grace and Jesus, His forgiveness and mercy and resurrection provide for us? Because this is a story, really, of a man raised from death to life. How might our baptismal identity as a child of God replace some of the other names that you have accepted for yourself? Or maybe other names that you want to place on other people. This is not at all to deny the importance or the scars that reside in anyone's lives, even for the triumphs of them. We might carry them, but they don't have to define us. But it is perhaps to remind us that the way forward is to the future. My driver's ed teacher was Angelo Ferdinandi. He was also a wrestling coach. He was a rough guy, a Marine, and so he always had a special way of communicating how to drive a car. This is in the day when driver's education, for those young people, driver's education was actually in the school. You had it as a class. You had to take it as a class. I know, it blows your mind. And it was actually in a car with two sets of... The whole thing is an amazing experience, especially for those of you that drive simulators now. Anyway, so he would lecture us, in fact, because you get nervous as a new driver, and you're always like looking in the mirror, somebody's coming behind me, So he always said, You know, look at the size of the windshield and look at the size of the mirror. It's more important to know where you're going than where you've been. So stop looking in the rearview mirror. Now, it was about driving, but it was a great life lesson. He didn't waste to tell us that too. That the key to getting where you want to go is to keep looking forward, making sure that the past isn't catching up with you, but looking forward. And this story is good news because Jesus invites this guy to stop looking to his past and to move forward into God's future. The past matters, but it's past. Okay, apply that to your pain and your alienations and the lack of reconciliation. The past matters, but it is past. Jesus' cross reminds us that the hurts and the sorrows and the mistakes and the regrets that have marked us may describe the past, but they don't have to define us, for we are God's beloved children. Some of you have been seeing The Shack. This is the story of the shack, of how the past becomes a place of enslavement and how God wants to move us into the future. Jesus' resurrection assures us that God's love is more powerful than any tragedy we've experienced. And some of those tragedies are real and leave a mark. But His resurrection reminds us that the way to the future with God is always open. And that's the good news about this man who has his sight. Amen.